Hi everyone, I'm Jenna Charlton, and this is Testing Treasure Maps, the art of crafting charters. Now, before we get too into things, I just want to take a moment to thank Anna and her team for including me today. It's great to be able to talk to you for just a little bit. So, a little bit about me for those of you who don't know me. I have lots of experience in testing. I think we're getting close to 15 years. I've kind of lost track, maybe intentionally. I am a developer advocate at Qase. Qase is a test case management software, but developer advocate really means test advocate because my focus is on testing and testers, and that's my community. I am a cat parent. I have two fuzzy little friends who share my home, Maka and Excalibur, who we call Purr for short. I'm a grad student in the Experience Design Master of Fine Arts program at Miami University. I love pro wrestling. I love punk rock. And my pronouns are they and them. So before we get too deep into things, I want to give you some thoughts that I have about this idea of exploration and exploratory testing. I believe that exploratory testing is about storytelling. It's about facilitating sharing and communicating what we've learned. It's telling the story of our testing in a way that is transferable and reusable and teaches us new things about software that we already know and understand, or maybe even software that we don't quite know and understand yet. It's about our intuition. The longer you're in testing, the more experience you get in testing, the more kind of spider senses you develop, the more you just kind of sense that something feels off, something feels weird, something feels like it's just not quite right. When we talk about coding, we talk about this idea of like code smells. Well, this is like test smells. It's like that thing that makes you scrunch up your face and go, doesn't look right, doesn't feel right. So our expertise is the driver when we look at exploratory testing. We're leaning on what we know so that we can expand our understanding. And it's about continuous learning. The more we explore, the more we learn about our software, the more we learn about testing itself. So this idea of exploration really leads to the continuous learning that is critical for us as testers. So I want to kind of tell you a story. This is a fun story as we work through our time together today. So we are going on a treasure hunt. We are looking to find the wizard's treasure. The problem is that we don't have a map. So we're going to have to kind of build that map as we go because the wizard didn't leave one for us. So I love what Elizabeth Hendrickson said in her book, Explore It, which let me tell you, if you want to get deeper into exploratory testing, please, please, please pick up Explore It. It's a fun, light, quick read. It is so worth it. There are so many great ideas in Elizabeth's book. But she specifically says when talking about why we should use charters, she says that exploring software has much, much in common with exploring territory. In exploring both territory and software, it's really easy to hike off into the wilderness and become thoroughly lost and go around in circles. But that's not what great explorers do, right? They have a specific goal, they prepare for their adventures, they bring along help and supplies to guide their path. Well, when we think about the adventure that we're taking, we're worried there might be dragons. We have to plan our journey appropriately. We need to think about what do we need to bring with us? What are we looking to explore? And what are we looking to discover to be prepared if we encounter a dragon, but also to hopefully avoid the dragon? So when we think about kind of explore with and discover, we're thinking about the charter template. Now, you can get really formal with these. When I worked at Progressive Insurance, which is where I first started doing true exploratory testing as opposed to kind of wandering my way into things. We'll talk about that later. But when I really learned kind of the technique of exploratory testing, they had this very formal, big template. And you can do that. You can use something that's really formalized and has a lot of detail. But really, all you need to get started is to understand what you're looking to explore, what you need to take with you, and what you're looking to discover. So when we think about what are we looking to explore, this is our target. Where in our app are we going? Or what are we looking at? And I say where because even if we're looking at a specific thing, it's still kind of a where in most cases. So let me get a little deeper in that. Let's say that you want to look at a feature. Well, your target is that feature. Or maybe we want to look and see if there's a way that we can cause user roles to fail. Maybe we're looking to see if there are gaps in our user roles. That would be our target in that case. And even though it's not a specific location in the app, it's still kind of our where. It's what we're looking to explore. And then what resources do we need to bring? Well, in some cases, this is easy. Like let's say that you're going to explore something in the APIs, you know that you need an API tool. You need Postman, you need Hopscotch, you need something like that. But maybe it's something a little less concrete, but you're still going to need resources. If you're looking at user roles, you're probably going to need a series of users all set up with different roles. You might need access to the LDAP system. So think about what resources you need to do this. And resources, by the way, can be things as simple as personas or even another person. If you decide that you're going to do paired exploratory testing, that other person would be one of your resources. And then what kind of information are we looking to gain? What are we looking to discover? What are we looking to find? That's something really critical because we don't go into this without a plan. We don't want to say, well, I know that I'm going to find X, Y, and Z, because then we're not exploring anymore. We've already made decisions. What we're looking to do is have a general idea of what kind of information we want to find. So in the case of what I said about user roles, we're looking to discover whether user roles are working correctly. We're looking to discover whether we have gaps in our user roles. We're looking to discover maybe what happens when users manipulate the shopping cart. They add things, they take things out, they maybe change quantities. What happens when we start making big changes in the shopping cart? Does it persist the way it should? Does it crash? Does it maintain? So think about what kind of information we're looking for. Not the exact thing that we're going to find, but the kind of information that we need to discover in order to understand our software better. So we've got a quick side quest here. We're going to encounter that dragon. He's right in front of us. So we're going to tell the dragon a story. And telling it a story is hopefully going to put it to sleep. Now, we don't actually want to put anything to sleep. We want our testing to be exciting. But I think you know where I'm going here. So we want to think about the language of exploration. What's the language that we use in our charter templates to effectively communicate to ourselves and maybe even to someone else what we're looking to explore? So we want to make sure that when we think about the language we're using, that it's not too narrow. Think about something like explore editing addresses with a value of 123-4 any street. Well, if we're looking to discover if it can handle special characters, we've directly said, 123-4. That's a test case as opposed to a charter. There's other ways that we could phrase this that wouldn't make this too narrow. But at the same time, we don't want to make things too broad because we don't want to have no goal in mind, and we don't want to put ourselves in a situation where we don't have some sort of plan in advance to get us to where we need to go. When you think about things being too broad, you need to think about how long something might take you. So something too broad might be explore hacking programs in the application to discover vulnerabilities. Well, that could take an hour, unlikely. It could take weeks. We just don't know. We don't have enough understanding or detail there for that to make sense yet. So it's too broad, it's too much. We also don't want to prevent exploration. And that means using things that could be answered with yes or no. So can a user change their password and log in with the old password? Well, nope, didn't work. Couldn't do that. Now, we don't want them to be able to do that. But at the same time, being able to answer that with a no stops exploration. Because once I've tried one thing, I'm done. We have to phrase this in a way that it invites trying multiple paths and attempts in different ways to look at this particular item so that it's not a yes or no answer. And we invite the conversation, we invite the exploration. And then finally, we don't want to use test cases. So don't have 1, 2, 3 instructions like step 1, step 2, step 3. The one caveat I will give there is that if you are working with something that is complicated, maybe it has a specific path that has to be taken to get to the feature you're looking at, you'll probably need to give that guidance. You might need to give it for yourself, or you might need to give it for somebody else. And it's okay to have kind of step-by-step instructions to get you to where you're going. But once you're at the location, the feature, the idea, the concept, then we want to make sure that we're using that really guiding language. So what we want to do is we want to have a good, meaningful scope. So explore editing addresses with various formats and characters. This could be expanding on what we just talked about. So make sure it can handle special characters. Well, sure, that's one address format we need to look at, because some addresses do have dashes and some other special characters. But also, can it handle an address that's from another country? In the US, our addresses follow a very specific format, especially our zip codes. They're always numbers. But in other countries, the postcode is different, and it includes numbers and alpha characters. So you think about, like, how can we make this scope meaningful and lead us to good testing? Another thing to think about, like with good scope, we looked at that too broad idea of explore hacking programs. We'll make the scope meaningful by focusing on something. So explore security risks with SQL injection in the application. Now we've said, okay, we're going to look at our vulnerabilities here, but we're going to look at one vulnerability. We're going to look at SQL injection. And maybe we're going to do a series of these. So we've got a whole plan for exploratory security testing, but we're going to develop these charters. We're going to develop our testing so that we're looking at things that are a reasonable scope and we can do in a reasonable amount of time. We want to invite exploration. So thinking about that idea of, can they log in with an old password after they've changed their password? That's a yes or no question, but we can invite exploration by saying, explore password manipulation with heuristics to discover if irregularities exist. This is great because we're going to talk about heuristics in a minute, but this gives you an opportunity to not use yes or no, but still get to what we're looking for, which is, can passwords be manipulated? And then think about guiding language. It is perfectly okay. In fact, it's more than okay. It's a good idea to have thoughts for yourself. I will be upfront. I'm ADHD. My memory is short. And sometimes I'll have a really good idea, and then I'll be like, okay, I'm going to remember that to go do this exploratory charter that I'm going to do tomorrow. And I get to tomorrow and I'm like, there was something I was going to do. I remember there was something I thought it was important to look at, but it's gone. I can't remember what it was anymore. And if I write it down, I might still lose it. But if I kind of make a note for myself in the base of the charter that I'm putting together, I'll have those ideas for later, for when I want to explore them. This is great because it just gives you the opportunity to take something that maybe somebody else has done, or a suggestion somebody made, or a note somebody had, and say, hey, don't forget to explore this particular thing. Don't forget to take a minute to look at this. So guiding language is great. I said we were going to talk about heuristics, and I'll tell you what, it's dangerous to go out and explore on your own. Heuristics are a great tool to take with you to help you make sure that you are staying on the path and you understand what you're looking at. So for those who don't have a background in heuristics or haven't heard of these before, heuristics are almost an undefinable thing. And I say that because we all have a slightly different definition. The semantics here are that there is a formal definition to heuristic, and then there's this like community understanding of what they are. So heuristics are about, to me, self-discovery. They're about a guide to problem solving. They're rules of thumbs. They're best practices that we've learned over the years. And they're a great source of ideation. They're a really good way to kind of step into test-based thinking and give us new ideas and new ways to explore things. If you want to get deeper into heuristics, and I highly recommend you do, Lena has written an incredible book. We're going to talk about Lena's favorite heuristics in a minute, but Lena's written this great book, and it has a series of cards called Would You Risk It? In fact, I have it on my shelf. It's a great way to get started in heuristics, so highly recommend. So let's take a look at a couple of folks' favorite heuristics. And even if you say, I don't know what heuristics are, this is really different, I guarantee you, once you see these, you'll be like, oh, I've seen that before. So let's talk about Simon Tom's favorite heuristic. His is CRUD, and this is something we all do every day. This is create, read, update, delete. And we do this with data, right? So we create data, we read data, we update the data, we delete the data. So you can always remember the things that we do with data, right? Remembering the acronym CRUD. So that's his favorite heuristic, and he loves it because he can combine it with other heuristics. Lena's favorite is Goldilocks. Too big, too small, just right. This is great because when you think about input fields, enough characters for the field, too few characters for the field, too many characters for the field. But there's all sorts of places we can use this. We can use this in API testing. We can use this in data testing. So Goldilocks is a great heuristic. And then some other great ones. Alex has this fantastic heuristic, poke it till it pops. This is on her blog. She has a whole series of what she calls micro heuristics. Poke it till it pops is all about something feels wrong, so I keep messing with it until it does what I think it's going to do because it feels wrong. If you go read her blog, you'll be able to read all about poke it till it pops because I think it's a fun one. Hillary Weaver Robb loves Unicode Snowman. This is a great one for like APIs and data. And my favorite is input method. And I've had people say, well, that seems awfully small, but input method is actually a huge heuristic. If you think about all of the different ways that we can input something into a field, this is about identifying if they all work. So we can click into a field and type. We can tab into a field and type. We can, if we're on mobile, use autofill, or on desktop, use autofill. We can use speech to text. We can use copy paste. There's all of these different ways that we can get input into a field. And do they all work? Do they all accept the data? So I want to make a shift here because we've talked about kind of things that we can do as we adventure along. But you also can use charters in another way. You can use exploratory testing in another way. And this is to use personas. Now, personas have kind of been genericized over the years. I don't love that they've been genericized, but I do think they're an incredibly valuable tool. They're a valuable tool for you to use in testing. They're a valuable tool for teams to use as they develop requirements. They're really, really useful. So I want you to think about this idea of using persona-based charters and kind of assembling your party and thinking about what personas do you need to test with to ensure that you have covered your exploration appropriately. Now, when we think about this, we're thinking about testing things like user roles. We're thinking about testing things like accessibility. We're thinking about testing things like usability. So when we think about that, we're thinking about, as a user who uses a screen reader, am I able to see or have the screen reader see everything on the page? Does it read me everything? Am I able to use keyboard only? We're talking about the most basic accessibility test here. Can I keyboard only my whole way through a page or through the app? So that would be an accessibility charter. When we think about usability, we might be thinking about, what if I was a novice user? What if I was a super experienced user? When we think about roles, we're thinking about, what if I was a free user? What if I'm a paid user? What if I'm a sysadmin? Like, what is it? What's my experience? What is it like to use my application as one of those users? When we use personas, and you have to develop your personas before you do this, you get the opportunity to step into their shoes and start testing that way. So we've got all of these things ready. We've got the basis of our map through the template. We've gathered some heuristics. We've thought about the language we use to help guide ourselves. We've thought about our party. We've got our personas together if we're going to do persona-based testing. But now it's time to really set out on this adventure and start building that map and looking for the treasure. So first thing we want to think about when we think about the testing that we're going to do, and we think about how big our charter question should be, how big our charter can be, is thinking about what's the risk. Because we have a goal here, and that goal is done. Now, done is different than perfect. We're looking for done. So we have to think about, as we plan out this testing and as we're moving through it, what's the impact of this potential failure that we think we might encounter? What's the impact of failure on this feature? How complex is this feature that we're looking to test? How complicated is it? How complicated is the back end of it? How many other features does it touch? And our goal here is to prevent waste. So if we say, well, the impact on this is really low, there isn't a lot of impact to this testing. When I say impact, this means if this particular item fails, that it's really not a big deal. There's workarounds. We're going to devote less time. If it's not terribly complex, we're probably not going to devote as much time because we want to prevent waste and make this testing meaningful, because we want to be able to move on to the next thing. So we have to think about this idea of time boxing and sessions. We're looking for our target here, our quality target, which is like a balance of time and effort and quality. So when we think about a time box, most of us use these for various things. This is a fixed amount of time that we're going to devote to our task. We use risk to drive this decision. So we think about what is the likelihood of failure. What is, in my case, I like to use complexity. What's the complexity of this particular feature? And what's the impact of failure? And if that's a low, then we're not going to devote a lot of time to this. I like to take time boxes of no more than like 2 hours and break that into sessions of 30 minutes. I like my sessions to be no more than 30 minutes because that's about how long my focus lasts. And then I'm off in the wilderness. But the sweet spot here is to balance risk with time to get to this idea of good enough quality. So our time box is how long overall we're going to devote. Our session is that time box broken down. And that's how we're going to determine how many sessions we have and what our time box is. So I want to tell you a real quick story. And I'm running out of time here, so I'm trying to be quick. But I want to tell you the story of what I feel like is my senior moment. If there was an Xbox style achievement that went up when I did this, this is the moment it would have happened. So I worked for this company. This was before I truly knew what exploratory testing was, but I was doing exploratory testing without realizing it. And this company was in the telematics industry, which means that they monitored vehicles using these onboard devices for fleets. So like big companies would have fleets of vehicles. And they had this idea of having a fleet manager with a list of drivers underneath it. And you would want this if your fleet was 10,000 vehicles. There isn't going to be one person running all 10,000 of those. There's going to be various managers throughout managing those different 10,000 vehicles. So I decided that I wanted to experiment because something felt wrong with this idea of fleet managers and their lists of drivers. We had a business rule. You couldn't take one fleet manager and assign them to another fleet manager's fleet. You couldn't nest them. And this was for very specific reasons. And on the front end, you couldn't do that. But the company also had customer-facing APIs that integrated with workforce management softwares that they used. Because this was for really big companies like Comcast or Johnson Controls, companies like that. So I said, okay, I know this doesn't happen on the front end, but something feels weird about the APIs. So I took one person and I made them a fleet manager and I gave them a list of drivers. And I took another person and I made him a fleet manager and I gave him a list of drivers. And then I assigned the second fleet manager to the first fleet manager. So I had Sally, and then nested, I had Tom. Now on the front end, you weren't allowed to do this. But when I did this through the API, it worked. It's like, well, this isn't great, but it's not the end of the world. And I said, okay, here's the real question. What happens if I now try and assign Sally to Tom? And it worked. I was like, oh, this is now where it's getting bad and scary. But I was like, okay, well, let's do the real test. And I did a get to try and pull my nested Sally Tom list back. And I just sat there. I just waited because, of course, it didn't return to the front end for me or return to SQL for me in SQL management. So sat there and I waited. And about 5 minutes later, Vlad, who was the DBA, came over and goes, what did you do to my test database? And I said, well, it's my database because it's test. And I did this. And here's what happened. And he said, nobody would ever do that. Why would you do that? I'm going to go fix the database. I was like, well, I'm not the smartest person in the room. So if I thought to do it, I'm sure a customer has tried to do it at some point. So I went over to my favorite developer who was really, really, really quality focused. And I said, hey, Will, I did this thing and here's what happened. And he looks at me with this wide-eyed expression and goes, why would you do that? And I said, well, because I could. And he said, I have to look into this. And I'm quoting the way I say this. And he goes and he looks at the production database and he comes back to me and he says, there's over 1,000 of these nested lists in the production database. And what had been happening is for a couple of years, the database would get a slowdown. And there was a process that ran, a job that ran, that terminated any transaction that was taking longer than X amount of seconds. I don't remember how many it was, because, if you have 10,000 drivers, they could try and pull back a report of 10,000 drivers. Again, we would terminate that because it's too big. So this was hiding behind that process running. So they discovered that this had caused for years little blips in performance in production, because nobody had experimented with this before. They had just assumed if it worked on the front end, it worked through the back end through the APIs. So this is where exploratory testing gets really, really powerful. When something feels wrong and we look at it and we say, ooh, okay, there really is something wrong here. This is why a charter is important. I didn't have the structure yet to formalize this. Now I do. So the way I approach this problem may have been a little bit different now, but I still would have looked into this because it still would have kind of raised those spider senses. So getting back on track for just a second, let's say you've lost your way. You've lost the scope. You're lost in the wilderness. That is okay. It happens. If you get lost, I want you to take a break. Go visit the tavern. What I mean by that is don't go have a beer, but go get a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, have a glass of water, take a break and come back to it. It's okay. We all get lost in our testing sometimes. Document your journey. As you are testing, make sure to take notes as you go. Or use a screen recorder. I'm not good at taking notes. I use a screen recorder. Also, if you have things that you're like, this just feels wrong, take notes of those so that you can go back to them later. You want to start a new session with a new exploratory template, a new charter. If you find yourself in a situation where you say, there's this thing that feels weird, it's got my hackles raised, I want to go look into it. Don't look into it in the same session. Start a new charter. And finally, make sure to debrief with a peer. Always share what you've learned on your adventure. So here's what we learned along the way. We found the treasure. We used all of our tools in our toolbox. We used our template, and we learned along the way how to explore, what to take with us, what to discover. We've learned to tell the story of our testing and to share that information that we've gained. We learned to use heuristics, and we talked about personas, and we learned that we use risk as our guide. So I really, really appreciate the time that I got to spend with you all today. And I just want to add a little note here. Because exploratory testing is about learning something new about your software, if you find yourself stuck, if you're like, man, I haven't had a thought about my software in a couple of days. I haven't felt like I've learned anything new about my tool in a couple of days. It's a good idea to just come up with something to do some exploratory testing on. It's critical that we learn new things about our software all the time. So if you feel like you're getting bored, if you feel like you haven't come up with something new to explore in a while, or something new that you have questions about in a while, find something to do some exploratory testing with, just to get those juices flowing again. Always try to learn something new as often as possible because it keeps your software relevant for you. Some additional resources. Elizabeth Hendrickson has a blog, Test Obsessed. She also has her book that I mentioned, Explore It. I've got a link here to Alex's micro heuristics and a link to Lena's blog. I believe you can buy a copy of Would Heurist It, both cards and book, on her blog. So thank you so much for your time today. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.